Videos like this are made possible by the generous support of patrons like Weir. Thanks, Weir. Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Video Penguin, and welcome back to For All Kerbalkind, and we're rejoining the crew of Rogatka on their mission to fly by Venus. I got a pretty wild reception to the launch of this mission in the last episode. Most of my comment section were asking simply how I planned the trajectory, planned the mission, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, but most of N9's comment section was just like, well, those Kerbals are dead. As if I would launch this mission without being confident that I could actually pull it off, and I am confident that we can pull this off. It's not going to be easy, but it's well within the capabilities of this vehicle, otherwise I wouldn't have risked 2 of my Kerbnauts' lives, particularly not one of my patron-named Kerbal's lives. This, of course, is Mikael, named by Jordan Millward, who is our cosmonaut from the Republic of Cuba. And they're a scientist, and I was wondering potential reasons why they'd be selected for this mission. Perhaps they were the scientists that designed the trajectory. The idea of a Venus free return trajectory, although of course this isn't a free return, we are performing a maneuver at Venus, it wasn't something that was really thought of until the Apollo era and, well, the Apollo applications program. So, well, maybe Millie did design that trajectory. Speaking of which, you see here the magical moment in which I finally planned out our entire trajectory, and voila! We have enough fuel and enough life support to make it back to Earth. We have the trajectory set in stone, and as you can see, we're going to be screaming in over the Antarctic. We don't really have enough fuel to adjust that. We might be able to adjust it a little bit, but that particular maneuver to adjust the latitude that we're landing at isn't going to be for about another year. You can see Venus in the background there. We're forming our first of a handful of course corrections. This is a fairly major one, but it's going to send us into the appropriate flyby of Venus, and then at Venus we're doing a 500 meter per second burn just to accelerate and increase our apoapsis around the sun, which just slows us down and allows Earth to catch back up with us. With regard to how I planned this mission, it really was just Transfer Window Planner. It's an incredible mod, and it tells you not only the location of your transfer windows, but then you can, well, simply enter the date at which you're going to reach that planet, and it will tell you the amount of delta V and the location of the transfer window, the amount of time it will take, but also the phase and ejection angles you need. So simply use that to plan your flyby of Venus, and then create a maneuver node as far forward in time as it says you're going to encounter the Earth, and then I just move that maneuver node until it intersected with Earth's orbit, and voila, an encounter appeared. I hope that made sense. Regardless, we're going to be rejoining the crew of Rogatka again at the end of the episode, but in the meantime we're unlocking space station solar panels, which means we can finally solve the power problems that Salyut 1 experienced. But before we can launch that, we need to research yet another technology, and while we're waiting for that, we're launching Pogoda 16. Now this is yet another geostationary weather satellite for a contract, and it's actually the last of these we're going to launch, because we've been launching a lot of them, and we don't really need the money anymore. We needed the money in the lead up to the first moon landing, but now our infrastructure is pretty well established and we're getting millions of funds from all of our lunar exploration contracts. I think these contracts certainly made the difference in getting our research lead ahead of the Americans, but we really don't need to rely on them so much now. And as you'll find out later in the video, a lot of our satellites that we haven't been handing off to customers, because we've pretty much been exclusively launching commercial contracts from Plesetsk for the last few episodes, a lot of them are dying. We've only just upgraded our solar panel technology, and a lot of the previous ones have degraded and the satellites have run out of power. So our communications network is not what it once was. So we have a lot of black spots in our communications network, and really we need to be launching more satellites to replenish that, and particularly some satellites into geostationary, as it's now pretty cost effective for us to do so. It used to be quite an undertaking to launch something into geostationary, and it was very unreliable, Svit 1 and Svit 2 of course being evidence of that. But with this particular vehicle, we've now got geostationary launches pretty much down to a T, so we really need a network of at least 3 geostationary satellites, and then perhaps a few more in Tundra and Molniya orbits. But that will be in the next episode. That is the last launch from Plesetsk for this one. And we head back to Baikonur and we're launching Lunokhod 3. Yes, we're launching yet another lunar rover, but it's a bit of a different design to the previous ones. And of course, it's being launched on a Yakko booster rather than being launched on an N1 with a backup LK. So we have a few lunar rover exploration contracts lined up, but I don't think that the N2, even with its hydrolock stages and the larger, higher capacity lander that I'm working on at the moment, I don't think it's going to have the payload capacity to bring a rover. So, engine failure permitting, we're trying to launch a rover to not only explore the lunar surface and get us some science, but also land in advance, find a decent landing site, and then allow our Kerbals to then move around the surface. So essentially you're launching the rover separately to the crew. Unfortunately, Lunokhod 3 didn't get off to a great start because the RD-0212 engine exploded, losing 1400 meters per second of delta V. Thankfully, this doesn't necessarily spell doom for the mission because we have a brand new engine. This is the RD-301 fluorine and ammonia engine. Now, some of you might be wondering why we're not launching from our hazardous payload pad, which is still under construction, if we're using fluorine. Myself and N9 came to an agreement that we only need to launch from those pads and their associated costs and everything if the toxic fuels, such as fluorine, pentaborane, or some kind of nuclear rocket engine, if it's actually part of the launch vehicle itself. We class this as payload. Essentially, the way we differentiate that is if the toxic engine ignites once it's in orbit already, then you can class that as payload, and that allows him to launch nuclear engines on Sea Dragon or whatever on Earth he's planning in future. Unfortunately, the aforementioned black spots in our communications network come to bite us here, and we lose control of the probe. So we had tight delta V margins to begin with after losing that upper stage engine, and now the mission is just impossible. So we're going to try and launch it again. Launching in the rain. And if you're wondering where on earth this stormy night has come from, this is actually BlackRack's volumetric clouds mod. It's added rain and lightning, which you'll be seeing below the spacecraft in orbit throughout this episode, with configs written by Ballistic Fox. Now, we can't distribute those. They're on BlackRack's Patreon, and also Ballistic Fox's configs are very much a work in progress. The whole thing's very much a work in progress, so we wouldn't want to distribute those. So you have to get in touch with /support, the actual creators of those, if you want them yourself. But this time, thankfully, the third stage performs as expected, and we get into orbit with a full fuel tank full of ammonia and fluorine. Although we do actually lose some of our fluorine because I didn't put enough multi-layer insulation on this tank. I did put some on it, but I didn't put the maximum on there because I didn't realize quite how badly liquid fluorine boils off. But yeah, it boils off quite extensively, so we end up losing about half the delta V left in the fuel tank after completing our translunar injection burn. But we still have more than enough to get into orbit of the moon once we arrive. So these rovers are not only going to explore the lunar surface, this particular one is actually exploring a site on the far side of the moon, which makes it the first rover to land there and explore it. But also they're going to be collecting surface samples because, well, we know crew are going to visit these rovers. They need to use them to explore the surface in future. So we might as well collect surface samples from a variety of different farside biomes, and then the crew that land can simply collect those surface samples from the rover. It's kind of like lunar sample return mission, just we're sending crew to go pick them up. But obviously the rovers have seats on them, 2 seats in fact, because we're planning to land 2 crew in our future lunar missions. And so therefore they can use that to explore the lunar surface. You'll notice that it uses tracks as well. I just thought that it looked kind of cool. I don't know if the Soviets would actually use tracks on their rover design. They do in For All Mankind, if I remember correctly, but I don't know if that's just to differentiate it from the American rover. Having actually designed a rover that uses tracks for my master's project now, the Venus rover project, which has a video in the works, I learned all the reasons why you would and wouldn't use tracks, and tracks are pretty much superior to wheels in every way except for mass and the amount of energy you need to actually drive them. And of course, those are things that are in short supply on a space probe, so you don't really use them unless you have to. And if you can see where you're going with a camera, you don't really need their ability to climb over obstacles, because you can, well, just avoid them. Obviously with our Venus rover, that wasn't an option since it couldn't use electronics. You can see here that our descent was exciting, to say the least. I started in a little too low of an orbit, so we had to adjust the angle of attack, I suppose that would be the name of it, even though we're not in an atmosphere, and fly up over the ridges of a few craters. But thankfully, with only a few meters per second of fuel remaining, we managed to come in for a landing. Cutting it pretty fine, but we did lose about 600 meters per second of delta V just from fluorine boiling off. So yeah, we were still cutting things a little fine. It's a good thing I left big margins on these space probes. I really didn't know whether to rely on the fluorine engine too much, so I just thought, we can heft 21 tons into orbit, so let's just put in more fuel than we'll actually need. But there we go, Lunokhod 4 touches down in the highlands on the far side of the moon, and now we have the rather tricky job of driving down the little ramp, which is easier said than done, because for some reason in Kerbal Space Program, the landing gear just refused to grip the surface, so everything slides. I did sort of reduce the spring strength in those landing gears, so we're actually sitting on the engine, which seems to slide a little slower than that landing gear does. But seriously, why is it so difficult to just increase the friction of landing gear? You'd think that would be something that could be fixed with a simple patch, but what do I know about game design? Regardless, some careful maneuvering later, we do manage to drive down the ramp. It's a little steep, and we almost rock the rover a little bit too aggressively. That giant square on the back of it is a giant battery, so it's a little bit back heavy, but thankfully we touch down safely, and we can deploy our scientific instruments and begin driving off. It'll take a little while to complete our science experiments in each biome, but we're actually going to head straight over to the first site we need to explore, Rover Site Alpha, and then once we reach that, we'll need to travel to a few different sites around the lunar surface. But we're going to be using the Bon Voyage mod, which means that the rover will move in time warp while we're not actually focusing on it, so we don't have to drive it manually. You can see all the various different science experiments, some of them new scientific experiments as well. We've got a mass spectrometer and a bunch of different things on there, as well as a Kerbal Engineer cassette tape computery thing. That didn't really need to be on there, I just thought it looked kind of cool and gives the rover some personality. It almost looks like it has a face as well, because it's got those giant lamps on it and then the TV camera, which makes it look like it has eyes and a nose. Importantly, I actually added a winch to the back of it. That was a very last minute addition, which I didn't notice actually offset the center of mass a bit, and you can see we got very close to running out of reaction control for us to propellant on our descent, because the center of mass of the space probe was slightly off. I just added the winch right before launch, thinking, ooh, that might actually be useful. Simply because I thought back to that episode of For All Mankind where they go prospecting for ice and they realize, oh, we should have brought a winch. We need to lower someone into a crater. So in case we want to do some similar exploration of our own, well, of course we are going to be prospecting for future base sites. We may well be visiting Shackleton Crater. We might want to have a winch with us. You can see here collecting our first of many surface samples as we head over to the major craters, which is the location of Rover Site Alpha. I believe we can store about 5 surface samples, so that's more than enough for us to map a decent chunk of the far side of the moon and then send the rover over to whatever our landing site is for Rodona 8. Moving onwards, we've unlocked Space Station Attitude Control, which now gives us all the technology we require to launch our second generation of space stations, which we will be doing a little bit later in the episode. But in the meantime, Lunokhod 4 has actually made really good time, and over the course of a few days has made its way over to one of the major craters. Now, I'm not familiar with craters on the far side of the moon, so if anyone knows the name of this particular small crater, then please do let me know. But after visiting the first site, we can then turn around and begin our journey to Rover Site Bravo. For some reason, the major craters and the highlands of the moon are completely bereft of large boulders. I did briefly think that parallax might not be working properly, but it is. We do see some large boulders briefly later on in the episode. So I'm not sure why that is. Perhaps Parallax just doesn't generate boulders in certain biomes, or maybe some planetary geologists can let me know why you wouldn't see large boulders in the highlands and larger craters of the moon. I don't know if the impact that created the crater might just launch any larger debris further afield. Please do let me know in the comments below if you have any idea, but I'm sure it's of interest to the Kerbal planetary geologists in the Soviet Union. We then head on over to Riverside Bravo. We get a rather beautiful view of the edge of this crater, and then we head on up to Riverside Charlie to complete our contract. This was actually quite fun, not gonna lie. Parallax just makes surfaces look so much better. It's really a joy to explore them. It honestly just makes rover gameplay, which isn't particularly engaging, it's just driving from point A to point B, so much more interesting, and the views were just stunning. I think with mods, Kerbal Space Program 1 angles more towards photorealistic, where of course Kerbal Space Program 2 has gone more cartoony. I'm not saying that's the wrong direction for it to take. I do like that Kerbal Space Program 2 has got a more uniform art style, but particularly with restock and the like, Kerbal Space Program 1 just looks absolutely gorgeous, and the volumetric clouds in KSP1 just never cease to amaze me. Every single launch this episode, when you fly up through the clouds, just looks amazing. It actually takes my breath away. That contract is now complete, and so we move on to the first of a plethora of second generation space stations. This is Salyut 2. At least that's the public name of this space station. Internally, it is Almaz 1. This is the first of several military space stations. And you'll notice the launch vehicle's missing an engine. And I say you'll notice this. I actually didn't notice this when I flew the mission. I wondered why Yaka Booster was quite difficult to control. But I genuinely didn't notice this until post, and I have no idea why it's missing an engine. I think a bit of debris might have been left on the launch pad. I just forgot to clear. Sometimes with these Kerbal Constructs launch pads, they don't clear properly, and I think it just spawned in sort of inside part of the launch clamp for Lunokhod 4, and so blew up one of the engines. Regardless, we had an engine failure, let's just say, but it didn't actually affect the launch. It went off without a hitch. The rest of the engines overburned slightly, and we're fine. So I didn't even notice while I was flying. I was just looking at the footage and like, what? Why am I missing an engine? That's bizarre. You see there's a little lightning storm below us there, which is pretty incredible. If you see it from the ground, you actually not only get the flash of the lightning, but you see the forks of the lightning as well. This volumetric clouds mod just gets more and more incredible every single update. It really, really does. But you can see Salyut 2, or Almaz 1, as it is internally referred, as I said, in all of its glory. It's a light blue color this time, and it's actually got a giant telescope in it, but not for looking to the heavens. No, this is effectively a crude spy satellite, which is akin to the role of the Almaz stations in reality. Of course, Salyut 2, or Almaz 1 in reality, lost attitude control within about 2 weeks of launch and then depressurized, so it never got visited by any crews. That had to be saved for Salyut 3/Almaz 2. But ours launches into a polar orbit, in fact near a sun-synchronous orbit, pretty much flawlessly, and is now ready for a crew to visit it. But before we do that, we're launching yet another lunar rover. Yes, we've got a contract for 2 of these left, so we might as well launch a second one, and we're planning for at least 2 rover exploration crewed lunar landings, so we need 2 of them, really. But unfortunately, the third engine strikes again, and we lose the O212 engine. But this time, we don't lose communication with the probe, and so the RD-301 can do a little bit more heavy lifting and try and save the mission. And we also have the adequate amount of MLI now, so we don't lose much fuel to boil off. The 301 really is incredible. It's got a comparable thrust to the RD-58M we've been using, but it has a specific impulse of 400 seconds compared to the RD-58's 350. which is approaching Hydrolox levels. Our first Hydrolox engine will give us about 450 seconds, but the fuel, of course, is so much denser and it doesn't boil off anywhere near as rapidly as hydrogen does. So this really does have a place in the future of our uncrewed space probes. I'm not putting crew on it though. I know some of the planned N1 derivatives did want to put crew on fluorine engines, but I don't think that's a great idea. They also wanted to put crew on nuclear engines. I just think putting nuclear engines on an expendable launch vehicle is such a bonkers idea. I know we will use nuclear engines in the future, but I think we'll probably exclusively use them in space. Unfortunately, that engine failure did just take a little bit too much delta V. We once again lost about 1300 meters per second, and we end up 80 meters per second short of landing on the lunar surface. That's what I meant about briefly seeing some boulders, because, well, we fly into them. And the space probe is destroyed. Oh well, we'll try again, but that will be in the next episode. Before then, we're going to launch Soyuz 9. And this has got 2 Kerbals with the highest security clearance aboard. We've got Marco, who of course was named by my patron NX74656, and he is from the Lithuanian SSR. And we have a new Kerbal aboard, and his name is Ilgiz Kerman, who was named by another one of my Emperor Penguin tier patrons, Darth Malakor, so thank you for submitting that. Ilgiz is from the Russian SSR, so of course not an Intercosmos mission, even though we do have 2 Kerbals named by patrons. They wanted them from the Soviet Union, so they have the clearance to be able to fly to this space station. Now, the benefits of it being in a sun-synchronous orbit means that it's pretty much in perpetual sunlight. I did obviously learn from my lessons with Salyut 1, and I put way bigger solar panels on Salyut 2, as well as massively increased electric charge storage. So even if it was in eclipse, which it will be once the Earth moves around the sun, since sun-synchronous orbits don't work properly in Kerbal Space Program, as it doesn't model the non-spherical shape of the Earth and the gravitational anomalies and perturbations that creates, which you can utilize to keep a spacecraft perpetually illuminated. It will be fine even if it does enter eclipse. But it means that we get a pretty beautiful view of just sort of perpetual sunset while we're flying to the space station, at least in its initial orbit. But it does also mean that not only is it going to be very difficult for N9 to visit this spy satellite, but also it's going to be flying over the US at regular intervals, so we can get all of that juicy spy data. And this isn't just roleplay as well. The space station does actually have a photography experiment on it, the Photography Experiment 3, which we've just unlocked. I did have to add that to the space station in the configs, but N9 was fine with me doing that. Now, normally it's supposed to replicate an American spy satellite, and you have to launch it 10 times to get all the data. N9 was fine with me reducing that to 4, since I am launching entire space stations and crewing them rather than smaller uncrewed satellites. But these experiments are going to take a long time. In fact, the total experiment duration is 10 years, so we can do that with 4 launches, which means each of these space stations is going to need to be up for 2.5 years. We're not going to keep it crewed for that entire duration. In fact, we're just sending up the crew for 30 days to complete our first space station contract, which we unfortunately failed with Salyut 1, and then we're going to return them back down to the ground. I've got no reason to believe that N9 has any plans to visit these. Now I say that, I'm slightly concerned about it, but at least for the moment we don't really have any need for any countermeasures, but perhaps our future Almaz stations might incorporate some defense systems, which does form the basis of some missions I do have planned for the next couple of episodes, but you'll have to wait and see what I have in store there. But as I said, the station's going to remain uncrewed for the majority of its lifespan. We can't really resupply it easily, as it doesn't have a second docking port. You obviously need a crew on the station to transfer those supplies, otherwise it doesn't really make much sense. Of course, we do have later Salyut models which do have the 2 docking ports, allowing for a progress resupply vessel to dock or even potentially expansion of the station. But we do also have the unlaunched 2 docking port version of the military space station, which was designed but is now residing in a museum. So I'm thinking that our final one of these stations will be of that type. So if we decide we want to keep operating them after 2.5 years, we can perhaps expand that one, keep resupplying it, and keep a military presence in space. Of course, by then, I hope to have the Spiral space plane visiting these space stations rather than the Soyuz. You'll note that I did go for a slightly different color for the military Soyuz. I decided to go for a lighter green to more closely match the color scheme of the space station. I just thought it'd be fun to differentiate our military missions from our civilian ones. You see here the space station orienting itself towards the sun, and then we cruise on in for a pretty flawless docking, though I say so myself. The crew is also going to be needed to return the film. Although some of the data can be transmitted with this photography experiment, the vast majority of the scientific data is still a sample which we need to return to the surface, and we haven't quite unlocked the technology for the Almaz film return canisters and their associated retro motors. We will unlock those for probably the 3rd and 4th stations, but for now the crew does actually need to return them. So once they've had their 30-day stay, we'll be returning at least one more time near the end of its lifespan to return the film, and we might also return a few times before then. It depends whether or not the Americans compromise the station or not. We might need to attach some countermeasures to the exterior with an EVA. That would be pretty cool, wouldn't it? We do have a few ideas as to how we might do spy satellite or military countermeasures in space between passing the save file and activating action groups. We're not installing BD Armory. I know many of you are very eager to point out that one of the Almaz stations had a cannon on it that they actually fired shortly before it deorbited. We're yet to figure that out, but I'm sure we'll come up with something creative in future episodes. But now the crew is resident aboard Salyut 2, we return to Rogatka as they complete the 60-day crew duration contract. Now, they did actually complete the 30-day milestone, and they have now been in space for 90 days since those contracts reset when you complete each one. They still have yet to beat the K4 station's record of over 100 days in orbit, so they're getting close, and they will beat that record in the next episode when they fly by Venus. As usual, this episode's save and craft files plus an installation guide are in the £1 tier on my Patreon, and I'll see you all next time, which will be in a month or longer because I am going traveling and also I'm moving for my new job, so it's going to be a little bit busy in the coming weeks before I settle into a routine. A massive thank you to my patrons and donators for their generous support, and an extra special thank you to The Amazing Steak, Dakota Clark, Olaf Hammerhand, Peter Lushtinetz, Lady Lagsalot, Madzor, Simone67, Scott Milligan, Jesse Smith, NX74656, Jordan Millwood and Darth Malakor.